The sun cast long shadows across the dusty street of Redemption Creek, as the crowd gathered for what was possibly the most despicable auction the Montana Territory had seen in the summer of 1878. Margaret Flynn stood trembling on the makeshift platform, clutching her 6-month-old son William to her chest, her eyes reflecting both defiance and terror as the auctioneer prepared to sell them to the highest bidder to settle her late husband's debts. The tension in the air was palpable as Margaret stood there, her chestnut hair falling from beneath her bonnet, the fine layer of trail dust doing nothing to hide her natural beauty, despite the circumstances. Little William, oblivious to their fate, cooed softly against his mother's worn calico dress. The crowd was a mix of miners, ranchers, and townspeople, some looking away in shame, others calculating what use they might make of a young widow and her baby. "Folks, as executor of the late Patrick Flynn's estate, it falls to me to settle his considerable debts," announced Silas Turner, the banker who'd orchestrated this horror. "Before you stands his widow and child, strong woman, good for cooking, cleaning, and whatever else you might need." His suggestive tone made Margaret's stomach turn. Bidding starts at $50 for the pair. Miles Sutton had ridden hard for 3 days, barely stopping to rest his exhausted buckskin stallion. He'd received word of the auction from a passing rider who'd mentioned it with disgust, and something in Miles' gut had compelled him to ride to Redemption Creek. He was a man of few words and fewer attachments, a drifter who'd spent the 10 years since the war moving from ranch to ranch across the Western territories. At 32, his face was weathered by sun and hardship, his dark brown hair streaked with early silver at the temples. As the bidding reached $75, Miles urged his horse forward, pushing through the gathered crowd. He arrived just as a burly miner raised the bid to $85, eyeing Margaret in a way that made her clutch her baby tighter. $100, came a gravelly voice from the back. The crowd parted, turning to see Miles atop his dust-covered horse. His blue eyes were steady beneath the brim of his worn Stetson as he dismounted with fluid grace despite his obvious exhaustion. "Mister, we're nearly done here," Turner protested. "This gentleman has bid $85. Miles walked toward the platform, each boot fall deliberate in the sudden silence. $100, he repeated, his voice carrying quiet authority, "and I'll take them now." Turner hesitated, looking from Miles to the miner who'd been bidding. "Sir, I don't believe I know you. Name's Miles Sutton. I've got the money right here." He pulled a small leather pouch from his vest pocket. $100 in gold, that cover the debt. Turner licked his lips nervously. "Well, actually, the debt is $120, Miles interrupted, adding more coins to the pile he'd placed on the auctioneer's table. "That should settle it." For the first time since he'd arrived, Miles allowed his gaze to meet Margaret's. What he saw there, a mixture of fear, hope, and fierce maternal protection, stirred something inside him that he thought had died years ago. "Going once," Turner called reluctantly. "Going twice. Sold to Mr. Sutton." The crowd murmured as Miles climbed the steps to the platform. Up close, he could see Margaret was younger than he'd initially thought, perhaps only 23 or 24. Her green eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Madam," he said softly, tipping his hat, "if you'll come with me." Margaret swallowed hard. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why would you do this?" Miles glanced around at the dispersing crowd, aware of the many eyes still watching them. "Not here," he said. "I've got a room at the boarding house. We can talk there." Her chin lifted slightly. "How do I know your intentions are any better than theirs?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You don't, but I give you my word as a gentleman that no harm will come to you or your boy under my protection." He hesitated. "I knew your husband." Margaret's eyes widened at this revelation, and after a moment's consideration, she gave a small nod. With as much dignity as she could muster, she allowed Miles to help her down from the platform. He collected his horse's reins and led them both toward the boarding house, acutely aware of the weight of responsibility he'd just taken on. Little William began to fuss, and Margaret gently bounced him in her arms. "It's all right, my love," she whispered, though her own uncertainty was evident in her voice. The boarding house was a modest two-story building with peeling white paint. Mrs. Abernathy, the proprietress, raised her eyebrows when Miles entered with a woman and baby in tow, but said nothing as he requested an additional room for Margaret. "I'm afraid we're full up, Mr. Sutton," Mrs. Abernathy replied. "What with the cattle buyers in town?" Miles nodded, unsurprised by the small town's limitations. "Then I'll take a cot in the storage room. Mrs. Flynn can have my room." Once upstairs, Miles unlocked the door to his small but clean room and stepped aside to let Margaret enter. She hesitated at the threshold, clutching William tighter. "I won't stay," Miles assured her. "I just thought you might want to sit somewhere private while we talk." Margaret nodded and entered, immediately taking stock of the sparse furnishings: a narrow bed, a washstand, a small table with a single chair. Miles remained by the open door, keeping a respectful distance. "You said you knew Patrick," she began, settling on the edge of the bed. Miles leaned against the doorframe, removing his hat. "We rode together during the war, lost track of him after. Heard he'd settled out this way." "You fought for the Union," Miles nodded. "Pennsylvania 7th Cavalry. Patrick was a good man, a brave soldier." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "He was a good husband too until—" She trailed off, gently rocking William, who was growing fussy. "Until what, Mrs. Flynn?" She sighed deeply. "The gambling, the drinking. It started small, but after William was born it got worse. I didn't know how bad the debts were until after the fever took him 3 months ago." She looked up at Miles, her eyes suddenly fierce. "But he loved us. Whatever his faults, he loved us." Miles nodded, understanding the complexity of the man he'd once known. "I believe that. So what happens now, Mr. Sutton? Have I traded one master for another?" The question was blunt, and Miles appreciated her directness. "No, madam. I have a small ranch about 2 days' ride from here. Nothing fancy, but it's peaceful. You and your boy can stay there until you decide what you want to do. I'll help you get on your feet." Margaret studied him suspiciously. "And what do you expect in return?" "Nothing." When she looked skeptical, he added, "I owed Patrick. Consider this payment of that debt." "No man does something for nothing, Mr. Sutton." Miles smiled faintly. "Maybe I'm not like most men." He straightened up. "Get some rest, Mrs. Flynn. We'll leave at first light tomorrow if that suits you." As he turned to leave, Margaret called after him, "Mr. Sutton, thank you. Whatever your reasons, thank you." Miles nodded once and closed the door behind him, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts and her baby. As he made his way to the storage room where he'd be spending the night, he wondered what had possessed him to take on a widow and her child. He'd spent the last decade avoiding entanglements, moving whenever roots threatened to take hold. Yet something about Margaret Flynn's fierce determination in the face of such humiliation had stirred him. And little William Miles had always had a soft spot for children, though he'd never expected to have any of his own. Perhaps it was simply that no decent man could stand by and watch a woman and child being sold like cattle. Whatever the reason, Miles knew his solitary life had just become considerably more complicated. Dawn broke with golden light streaming through the small window of Margaret's borrowed room. She had barely slept, alternating between nursing William and wondering about the mysterious cowboy who had purchased them from the auction block. Miles Sutton was a contradiction, rough-edged but gentle-spoken. intimidating in stature but careful in his movements. Most puzzling was his claim to want nothing in return for his help. Margaret had learned the hard way that generosity often came with hidden costs. Patrick had been charming and generous during their courtship, showering her with small gifts and grand promises. Only after their marriage did she discover his propensity for gambling away their meager savings and drowning his losses in whiskey. She had loved him still, trying to see the good man beneath the growing addiction, but his death had left her not only heartbroken but destitute. William stirred in the makeshift crib she'd fashioned from a drawer, his tiny fists waving in the air. Margaret lifted him, breathing in his sweet baby scent. "What do you think, my little man?" she whispered. "Can we trust Mr. Sutton?" A soft knock at the door interrupted her musings. She quickly adjusted her dress after feeding William and called, "Come in." Miles entered, already dressed for travel in a faded blue shirt and dusty denims, his gun belt slung low on his hips. He carried a small bundle. "Mrs. Abernathy sent up some breakfast," he said, placing the bundle on the table and unwrapping it to reveal biscuits, jerky, and a small jar of preserves. "And this." He held up a small tin of condensed milk. She thought the baby might need it on the journey. Margaret was touched by the thoughtfulness. "Thank you, and please call me Margaret. It seems strange to stand on formality with the man who bought us." Miles winced visibly at her choice of words. "I didn't buy you, Mrs. Margaret. I paid off a debt that was wrongfully attached to you and your son. There's a difference," she smiled faintly. "Is there? Either way, I'm now obligated to you. You're not obligated to do anything except what's best for you and William." He nodded toward the baby. "He's a fine-looking boy." "How old?" 6 months next week." She hesitated. "Would you like to hold him?" Miles looked startled by the offer, then uncertain. "I don't have much experience with babies. It's not difficult, just support his head and bottom." She stood and carefully transferred William to Miles' arms, guiding his hands into position. Miles stood rigidly at first, clearly afraid of hurting the infant, but William simply gazed up at him with curious blue eyes. Gradually, Miles relaxed, a smile softening his weathered features. "Hello there, young man," he said softly. Margaret watched the interaction with interest. There was a gentleness to Miles Sutton that contradicted his rugged exterior. William seemed to sense it too, as he made no protest at being held by the stranger. "We should get moving soon," Miles said, reluctantly handing William back to Margaret. "It's a long ride to the ranch, and I'd like to make good progress before the heat of the day." Margaret nodded, mentally cataloging her few possessions. "I don't have much to pack. Just what I could carry when they took our home." Something flashed in Miles' eyes, anger, perhaps, but he quickly controlled it. "Mrs. Abernathy found some supplies for the baby, and I've arranged for a wagon instead of horseback. Thought it might be easier with the little one." Margaret was touched by his consideration. "Thank you." An hour later, they were heading out of Redemption Creek, Miles driving the small wagon with Margaret and William beside him. Her worldly possessions consisted of 2 dresses, a shawl, William's baby blanket, and a locket containing a lock of her husband's hair. Miles had added supplies from the general store, food, diapers for William, and a few practical necessities. As the town receded behind them, Margaret felt both trepidation and relief. She was leaving behind the place where she'd known both happiness and devastating loss, heading toward an uncertain future with a man she barely knew. Yet somehow, sitting beside Miles Sutton as he handled the reins with quiet competence, she felt safer than she had in months. "Tell me about your ranch," she said as they settled into the journey. Miles kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "It's not much to speak of, 100 acres in the foothills. Small cabin, barn, corral, Got about 30 head of cattle and a few horses I'm breaking for sale. You live there alone, he nodded. Had a ranch hand last season, but he moved on to California. Been managing by myself since. It sounds peaceful. A small smile touched his lips. It is that. Quiet. Maybe too quiet sometimes. They fell into a comfortable silence as the wagon rolled through the rugged Montana landscape. The July sun beat down on them, but a light breeze made the heat bearable. William slept against Margaret's chest, lulled by the rocking motion of the wagon. "May I ask you something, Mr. Sutton Miles?" he corrected. "And yes, you may. Why were you in Redemption Creek? You said you heard about the auction, but from whom? And why did it matter to you?" Miles was silent for so long that Margaret thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "I was in Billings delivering horses when I ran into a man who'd just come from Redemption Creek. He mentioned the auction, said it wasn't right, selling a woman and her baby. Said the woman's name was Flynn." Miles adjusted his grip on the reins. "Patrick saved my life during the war. Took a bullet that was meant for me at Chickamauga. I figured if his widow was in trouble, I owed it to him to help." Margaret absorbed this information. "That's very honorable," Miles shrugged. "Just doing what needed doing." They stopped at midday to rest the horses and eat a simple meal of jerky, biscuits, and dried apples. Margaret took the opportunity to feed and change William, discreetly moving to a shaded area behind the wagon. When she returned, she found Miles filling a canteen from a small stream. "The water's good here," he said, offering her the canteen. "We'll camp a few hours ahead near Willow Creek. There's a protected spot, I know." Margaret nodded, grateful for his experience. She'd never traveled far from town before and found the vast, open country both beautiful and intimidating. As they continued their journey, Margaret studied Miles when he wasn't looking. There was a sadness about him, a solitude that seemed bone deep. She wondered what had happened in the years since the war to carve those lines around his eyes, to put that wariness in his gaze. By late afternoon, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, and a cool wind had replaced the earlier breeze. "Storm coming," Miles observed, glancing at the sky. "We might not make it to Willow Creek before it hits." As if confirming his words, a distant rumble of thunder rolled across the plains. William stirred, whimpering softly at the sound. "There's an old line shack about a mile ahead," Miles said. "Not much, but it's solid. We'll shelter there." The rain began just as the small wooden structure came into view, fat drops that quickly became a downpour. Miles urged the horses to a faster pace, pulling up beside the shack just as lightning split the sky. "Wait here," he instructed, jumping down from the wagon. He quickly checked the interior of the shack before returning for Margaret and William. "It's empty, bit dusty, but dry." He helped Margaret down, then gathered their supplies while she hurried into the shelter with William. The shack was indeed dusty but sound, with a small stone fireplace, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, and a narrow cot against one wall. Miles brought in their provisions, then went back out into the storm to tend to the horses and secure the wagon. When he returned, he was soaked to the skin, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. "Found some old firewood out back," he said, depositing an armload beside the fireplace. "Should be dry enough." Margaret had spread a blanket on the floor for William, who was contentedly kicking his legs in the air. "Let me help you with that fire," she offered. "You're drenched." Together they built a small fire, which soon cast a warm glow throughout the one-room shack. Outside, the storm intensified, rain lashing against the windows and thunder cracking overhead. Miles removed his wet coat and hung it near the fire to dry, then sat at the table to remove his boots. Margaret busied herself organizing their supplies and preparing a simple supper of beans, jerky, and the last of Mrs. Abernathy's biscuits. "It's not much," she apologized as she set a plate before him. "It's fine," he assured her. "Better than what I usually manage for myself." They ate in companionable silence, the crackling fire and drumming rain the only sounds besides William's occasional cooing. Margaret found herself relaxing for the first time in months. Despite the primitive conditions, there was something comforting about the small shack with its warm fire and the solid presence of Miles across the table. After they'd eaten, Miles insisted Margaret take the cot with William while he would sleep on his bedroll near the fire. As she settled William beside her, wrapping him securely in his blanket, Margaret watched Miles spread his bedroll on the floor. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Miles looked up, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight. "No need for thanks." "Yes, there is. You could have just kept riding. Most men would have." He was quiet for a moment. "Get some sleep, Margaret. We've got another full day of travel tomorrow." Margaret lay awake long after Miles had stretched out on his bedroll, his breathing becoming deep and regular. The storm continued outside, but within the shack, all was peaceful. William slept soundly beside her, his tiny hand curled against her arm. For the first time since Patrick's death, Margaret allowed herself to hope for a future that might hold more than mere survival. She didn't know what awaited them at Miles Sutton's ranch, but she was beginning to believe it might be a place where she and William could heal and perhaps even thrive. With that thought, she finally drifted into sleep, lulled by the rain and the quiet presence of the enigmatic cowboy who had, for reasons still not entirely clear to her, decided to save them. The storm passed during the night, leaving behind a washed, clean world glittering with morning sunlight. Margaret awoke to find Miles already up, tending to the horses outside. William was still sleeping peacefully beside her, his cherubic face relaxed in slumber. She quickly freshened up, using the basin of water Miles had left for her, then changed into her second dress, a faded blue calico that had seen better days but was clean and serviceable. By the time Miles returned, she had rekindled the fire and was warming the last of their coffee. "Good morning," she greeted him. "Coffee's almost ready." Miles nodded his thanks, removing his hat as he entered. "Trail's a bit muddy from the rain, but passable. We should reach the ranch by sundown if we make good time." They shared a quick breakfast of hardtack and dried fruit, then packed up their belongings. As Margaret gathered William's things, Miles surprised her by gently lifting the now awake baby. "Good morning, young man," he said, his deep voice softened. "Ready for another day on the trail?" William responded with a happy gurgle, reaching up to grab at Miles' beard-stubbled chin. Miles chuckled, a warm sound that transformed his usually solemn face. Margaret watched the interaction with a mixture of surprise and pleasure. Patrick had been an indifferent father at best, uncomfortable around William and quick to leave the room when he cried. Seeing Miles' natural ease with her son was both heartwarming and slightly painful, a reminder of what Patrick might have been had he lived to know his son better. They set out under clear blue skies, the wagon wheels occasionally sticking in muddy patches but making steady progress. As the day wore on, the landscape began to change, the flat plains giving way to rolling hills dotted with pine and aspen. By mid-afternoon, mountains were visible in the distance, their peaks still capped with snow despite the summer heat. "That's the northern edge of the Gallatin Range," Miles explained, noticing Margaret's interest. "My place sits in the foothills, just where that line of pines starts climbing." Margaret tried to imagine living in such a place, so different from the dusty streets of Redemption Creek or the crowded Boston neighborhood of her childhood. "It's beautiful," she admitted, Wilder than I'm used to. It grows on you, Miles said. The space, the quiet. He glanced at her. Though I reckon it might seem too quiet after town life. After the last few months, quiet sounds heavenly, Margaret replied, thinking of the constant whispers and judgmental stares that had followed her after Patrick's death and the revelation of their debts. They stopped briefly at a clear stream to water the horses and stretch their legs. William was fussing, hungry and tired of the constant motion, so Margaret found a shaded spot to nurse him while Miles refilled their canteens. "How much farther?" she asked when he returned. "Another 3-4 hours. We'll need to stop again before then, give the horses a proper rest." Margaret nodded, gently burping William. "He's been so good, considering, barely complained at all." "He's a strong boy," Miles observed. "Like his mother." The compliment, delivered matter-of-factly, caught Margaret off guard. She'd spent months hearing nothing but criticism and pity from the townspeople. To be seen as strong rather than pathetic was refreshing. "I'm not sure about that," she said softly. "If I were truly strong, perhaps we wouldn't have ended up on that auction block." Miles frowned. "That wasn't your doing. That was Turner and his ilk taking advantage of a bad situation. Still, I should have found another way." "What way?" Miles asked. "From what I gathered, they took your home, your possessions. You had a baby to care for and no family to turn to. Don't be so hard on yourself, Margaret." His words, gruff but kind, eased something tight in Margaret's chest. She hadn't realized how much she'd internalized the blame for their situation. They continued their journey, the terrain growing more rugged as they approached the foothills. Late afternoon, sunlight slanted through the increasing stands of pine trees, casting long shadows across the trail. William had fallen asleep against Margaret's chest, one tiny hand clutching a lock of her hair. "There it is," Miles said as they crested a small rise. "Home." Below them, nestled in a clearing surrounded by pines, sat a modest cabin with a stone chimney. A short distance away stood a barn and corral where several horses grazed. A small creek wound through the property, its banks lined with willows. It was simple but undeniably beautiful, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. "Oh," Margaret breathed. "It's lovely." Miles looked pleased at her reaction. "It's not much, but it's peaceful." They made their way down the slope to the cabin. As they drew closer, Margaret could see details she'd missed from a distance: a small vegetable garden to one side of the cabin, a woodpile neatly stacked against the barn, a rocking chair on the front porch. Evidence of a life carefully built. Miles halted the wagon in front of the cabin and helped Margaret down before tending to the horses. She stood for a moment, absorbing the quiet beauty of the place. The only sounds were the soft nickering of horses in the corral, the gentle gurgle of the creek, and the wind sighing through the pines. "Let me show you inside," Miles said, returning from unhitching the horses. He carried their few belongings as he led the way to the cabin. The interior was simple but well-crafted: a main room with a stone fireplace, a wooden table with 4 chairs, a rocking chair by the fire, and a few shelves holding books and essential supplies. A doorway led to what appeared to be a bedroom, and a ladder against one wall suggested a loft space above. "It's not fancy," Miles said, suddenly seeming self-conscious, "but it's solid, keeps out the winter cold." "It's wonderful," Margaret assured him, meaning it. After months of uncertainty and the humiliation of having her home seized, the simple cabin felt like a sanctuary. Miles showed her to the bedroom. "You and William can have this room. I'll take the loft." Margaret started to protest. It was his home. After all, but the look on his face told her it would be useless. Instead, she simply thanked him. The bedroom was spare but comfortable, with a bed covered in a handmade quilt, a small chest of drawers, and a window overlooking the creek. Miles set her bag on the chest and hesitated. "I'll start supper while you get settled," he offered. "Nothing special, but it'll be hot." Left alone with a sleeping William, Margaret took a moment to collect herself. The events of the past few days had been overwhelming, from the horror of the auction block to this unexpected reprieve. Miles Sutton remained something of a mystery, his kindness at odds with his obvious desire for solitude. Why would such a man take on the responsibility of a widow and her baby? She settled William on the bed, surrounding him with pillows to prevent him from rolling off, then took a moment to wash her face and hands in the basin Miles had provided. Her reflection in the small mirror above the chest showed a woman both familiar and strange, her features the same, but her eyes holding a weariness that hadn't been there a year ago. When she returned to the main room, she found Miles at the stove, cooking what smelled like venison stew. He'd removed his hat and coat, and with his sleeves rolled up, revealing muscular forearms, he looked more at ease than she'd seen him yet. "Can I help?" she offered. He glanced up. "There's bread in that bin if you want to slice some." They worked together in companionable silence, and soon a simple but hearty meal was on the table. Margaret checked on William, who was still sleeping soundly, before joining Miles. "He's exhausted from the journey," she explained. "I should probably wake him to eat, but I hate to disturb him when he's sleeping so peacefully." "Let him rest," Miles suggested. "He'll let you know when he's hungry." The stew was surprisingly good, rich with vegetables from Miles' garden and tender venison. Margaret found herself hungrier than she'd realized, accepting a second helping when Miles offered it. "This is delicious," she complimented. "You're quite the cook." A hint of color touched his cheekbones. "When you live alone, you either learn to cook or eat poorly." "How long have you been here?" she asked, curious about the life he'd built. "6 years. He broke off a piece of bread. "Bought the place after drifting for a while after the war. It was barely standing, then previous owner had let it go to ruin. Spent the first year just making it livable." "You've done a remarkable job," Margaret said, looking around at the well-constructed cabin. "It feels like a home." Something flickered in Miles' eyes, pleasure at the compliment perhaps, or something deeper. "It suits me," he said simply. As they ate, Margaret found herself telling Miles about her life before Patrick, growing up in Boston, the daughter of a schoolteacher, her dreams of becoming a teacher herself, before meeting the charming Irish immigrant who would become her husband. Patrick had such plans, she recalled. He was going to strike it rich in the goldfields, then start a business. We were going to have a fine house in town and half a dozen children. She smiled sadly. "Dreams fade quickly out here, don't they?" Miles nodded, understanding in his eyes. "The West has a way of stripping a person down to what's real. Some find that unbearable, others find it freeing. And you, which did you find it?" He considered the question. "Both at different times, now mostly the latter." A cry from the bedroom interrupted their conversation. "Excuse me," Margaret said, rising to tend to William. When she returned with the now awake baby, Miles had cleared the table and was stoking the fire against the evening chill. William was wide-eyed, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings with infant curiosity. "There's milk cooling by the window," Miles told her. "Fresh this morning before I left. My cow's in the barn. You're welcome to the milk as long as you're here." "Thank you." Margaret settled in the rocking chair, grateful for Miles' thoughtfulness. "This is more than I could have hoped for, when they put us up on that platform." She swallowed hard, the memory still raw. "I thought William and I were lost." Miles sat across from her, his expression somber in the firelight. "No one should have to endure that. Especially not Patrick's wife and child." "The debt was real," Margaret admitted. "I'm not disputing that, but the way they went about collecting it." She shook her head. "As if we were property, not people. Turner's had it coming for years, Miles said, a hard edge to his voice. He's ruined more than one family with his schemes. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and William's soft noises as he explored his new surroundings from the safety of his mother's lap. There was an ease between them that surprised Margaret, as if they'd known each other far longer than just 2 days. Eventually, William began to fuss, ready for his evening feeding and bed. Margaret excused herself, returning to the bedroom to nurse him and settle him for the night. When she emerged, she found Miles on the porch, smoking a cigarette and gazing at the stars now visible in the clear night sky. "He's asleep," she said softly, joining him. "Once he's down, he usually sleeps for several hours." Miles nodded, offering her the rocking chair while he leaned against the porch railing. The night was cool but pleasant, with a chorus of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl providing a gentle symphony. "It's so peaceful here," Margaret observed. "I can see why you chose it." Miles tapped the ash from his cigarette. "After the war, I couldn't stand to be around too many people. The noise, the demands, it was suffocating. Out here a man can breathe." "And a woman," Margaret asked, "can she breathe out here too?" Miles looked at her, his expression thoughtful in the dim light spilling from the cabin windows. "I reckon that depends on the woman," Margaret smiled. "I suppose it does." She rocked gently, considering her situation. "I won't be a burden to you, Miles. I can cook, clean, mend. I'm stronger than I look, and once William is a bit older, I'll find a way to make my own living." "There's no rush," Miles said. "You're welcome here as long as you need. I meant what I said I owed Patrick." Margaret studied him. "Was it a significant debt for you to feel such obligation?" Miles was quiet for a long moment. "He did more than take that bullet. After, when I was recovering, he wrote to my family, told them I was alive when they'd been informed I was dead, gave them hope when they had none." He looked out at the darkness. "That kind of debt doesn't expire with death." The depth of his loyalty touched Margaret. She was beginning to understand that beneath Miles Sutton's reserved exterior was a man of profound principle and honor. "Still," she insisted, "I want to contribute. It's important to me." Miles nodded, respecting her determination. "We'll figure it out." He crushed out his cigarette. "It's getting late and you've had a long journey. You should rest." Margaret rose, suddenly aware of her exhaustion. "Good night, Miles, and thank you again." "Good night, Margaret." As she made her way back to the bedroom, Margaret was struck by how quickly this place had begun to feel safe. Miles Sutton was still largely unknown to her, yet she trusted him in a way she couldn't fully explain. Perhaps it was simply that, after months of facing hostility and judgment in Redemption Creek, his quiet kindness felt like salvation. Whatever the reason, as she lay beside William in the comfortable bed, listening to the gentle sounds of the ranch at night, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time: hope. The days fell into a gentle rhythm at the Sutton Ranch. Margaret, accustomed to running a household, quickly took over the domestic duties, cooking meals that were far more palatable than Miles' bachelor fare and keeping the cabin clean and orderly. Miles spent his days tending to the cattle, training horses, and maintaining the property, but always made time to check on Margaret and William throughout the day. William thrived in the clean mountain air, growing stronger and more alert with each passing day. He had begun to pull himself up, eager to explore his new surroundings, and Miles had constructed a simple wooden playpen to keep him safe when Margaret needed her hands free for chores. One morning, about 2 weeks after their arrival, Margaret was hanging laundry on the line strung between 2 pines when she noticed Miles watching her from the corral. He quickly looked away when their eyes met, returning his attention to the young mare he was training. Margaret smiled to herself, finding his occasional shyness endearing in such a capable man. She'd learned more about him in their evening conversations by the fire. He'd been the youngest of 4 sons from a Pennsylvania farming family, had fought through most of the major battles of the war, and had spent the years after moving steadily westward, working ranches from Kansas to Wyoming before settling in Montana. He rarely spoke of the war itself, but Margaret sensed it had left scars beyond the visible one that ran along his left forearm. What struck her most was his natural gentleness with William. Each evening, he would hold the baby while Margaret prepared dinner, talking to him in a low, soothing voice about the day's activities on the ranch. William had taken to reaching for Miles whenever he entered the room, a development that seemed to both please and perplex the cowboy. As July gave way to August, the days grew hotter, though the evenings remained pleasantly cool. Miles had begun teaching Margaret to ride, using his gentlest mare, a dappled gray named Willow. Margaret had never been comfortable on horseback, but under Miles' patient instruction, she was gaining confidence. "You're a natural," he told her as they rode slowly along the creek one evening. "Just need to relax your shoulders a bit more." Margaret adjusted her posture, feeling the difference immediately. William was secured in a sling across her chest, contentedly watching the world from this new vantage point. "It's not as terrifying as I expected," she admitted, "though I doubt I'll ever match your skill." Miles chuckled. "Been riding since before I could walk. You're doing fine for a city girl." The term was teasing rather than derogatory, and Margaret smiled in response. This city girl appreciates the lesson. They rode in companionable silence for a while, enjoying the beauty of the early evening. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the landscape, turning the creek into a ribbon of fire. In the distance, a deer and her fawn emerged from the trees to drink, unalarmed by their presence. "It's like living in a painting," Margaret observed softly. "I never imagined such beauty existed." Miles looked at her, something warm in his gaze. "Nor did I once." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken meaning. Then William broke the spell by grabbing a handful of Willow's mane, causing the horse to toss her head in surprise. "Whoa there, young man," Miles said, reaching over to gently disentangle the baby's fingers. "That's not polite horse manners." Margaret laughed. "He's becoming quite the little adventurer. Yesterday I found him trying to climb out of his cradle." "He's got spirit," Miles said approvingly. "He'll make a fine horseman someday." The casual reference to William's future at the ranch hung in the air between them. Both were aware that their arrangement was temporary, yet neither had spoken of how or when it might end. As they turned back toward the cabin, Miles broached a subject he'd been considering. "The Founders' Day celebration is coming up in Whitefish Creek next Saturday. Thought you might like to go, get out a bit, meet some of the neighbors." Margaret was surprised by the invitation. "I'd like that, but are you sure? William can be fussy in crowds. Folks around here are used to babies," Miles assured her. "Besides, it might do you good to talk to someone besides this old cowboy." "You're hardly old," Margaret protested, "and I enjoy your company." A hint of color touched Miles' cheekbones. "Well, just the same, thought you might like a day in town. There'll be music, dancing, food." "It sounds wonderful," Margaret said sincerely. Then a practical concern occurred to her. "But I have nothing suitable to wear. This dress and my other are hardly appropriate for a celebration." Miles considered this. "Mrs. Caldwell at the general store might have something. We can head into town tomorrow if you'd like, see what's available." Margaret nodded, touched by his thoughtfulness. "I'd appreciate that." The small town of Whitefish Creek was a far cry from Redemption Creek Cleaner, more prosperous, with a genuine sense of community rather than the desperate frontier atmosphere that had pervaded her former home. The general store was well stocked, and Mrs. Caldwell, a plump, cheerful woman in her 50s, greeted Miles warmly. "Miles Sutton, as I live and breathe. Haven't seen you in months." Her curious gaze fell on Margaret and William. "And who might these folks be?" "This is Mrs. Margaret Flynn and her son William," Miles introduced them. "They're staying at my place for a while. Margaret, this is Ida Caldwell, who knows everything about everyone for 20 miles in any direction." Mrs. Caldwell laughed good-naturedly. "Don't you listen to him, dear. I just take an interest in my neighbors is all." She reached for William, who was watching her with wide eyes. "May I?" Margaret handed over her son, who immediately grabbed for Mrs. Caldwell's spectacles. "Careful, he's quite the little thief these days." "Oh, I raised 5 of my own. I know all about grabby little fingers," Mrs. Caldwell bounced William expertly. "Now, what can I help you folks with today?" Miles explained their need for a dress for the Founders' Day celebration, and Mrs. Caldwell's face lit up. "Oh, I've got just the thing. Came in on the last shipment from back east. Haven't had anyone to buy it, yet most of the women around here make their own, you know." She led Margaret to a corner of the store where a few ready-made garments hung on display. Among them was a lovely blue calico dress with white trim, simple but far more elegant than Margaret's worn clothing. "It's beautiful," Margaret breathed, touching the fabric reverently. "Try it on," Mrs. Caldwell encouraged, nodding toward a curtained alcove at the back of the store. "I'll mind the little one." The dress fit as if it had been made for her, the blue bringing out the green of her eyes and the style flattering her still slender figure. When she emerged from behind the curtain, both Mrs. Caldwell and Miles stared. "Oh my," Mrs. Caldwell said approvingly. "That's just perfect." Miles said nothing, but the admiration in his eyes spoke volumes. Margaret felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the summer heat. "We'll take it," Miles said finally, reaching for his wallet. "And a ribbon to match if you have one." "Miles, it's too much," Margaret protested, knowing such ready-made garments were expensive. "Consider it a gift," he said firmly. "You've more than earned it with all the work you've done at the ranch." Mrs. Caldwell watched this exchange with interest, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. As she wrapped the dress after Margaret had changed back into her own clothes, she engaged in what Miles had warned was her favorite pastime, gathering information. "So, Mrs. Flynn, are you from around these parts originally?" Margaret explained her background briefly, sharing only that she was a widow whose husband had died of fever. She made no mention of the auction, and Miles, she noticed, remained silent on the subject as well. "Well, you're welcome in Whitefish Creek," Mrs. Caldwell said warmly. "We're a friendly lot, not like some of those rougher mining towns, and Miles here is one of our most respected residents, though we see him too rarely." Miles looked uncomfortable with the praise. "Just busy with the ranch, Ida. Too busy for your own good," she chided gently. "Man needs more than work and horses for company." Her meaningful glance between Miles and Margaret made her implication clear. On the ride back to the ranch, Margaret found herself wondering about Mrs. Caldwell's observations. Had there been others before her who Miles might have courted? The thought provoked an unexpected twinge of jealousy that she quickly suppressed. Miles had been nothing but kind and honorable. His past was his own business. "Mrs. Caldwell seems nice," she commented as they followed the now familiar trail home. Miles nodded. "Salt of the earth. Bit nosy, but means well. Her husband was the town's first mayor before he passed on. She seems fond of you." A small smile touched his lips. "The Caldwells helped me when I first came to these parts. Jim taught me about ranching in Montana different from back east. And Ida made sure I didn't starve that first winter." Margaret was touched by this glimpse into Miles' early days in the territory. "You've built a good life here," Trying to, he agreed. Some days are better than others. William, who had been dozing against Margaret's chest, awoke with a cry of hunger. Miles immediately guided the wagon to a shady spot beneath a large cottonwood. "We can stop here for a bit," he offered. "Let you tend to him in privacy." Margaret was continually moved by his consideration. Patrick, for all his charm, had never shown such awareness of her needs or William's. As she nursed her son in the shade of the tree, she found herself comparing the two men more and more often, usually to Patrick's disadvantage. It wasn't fair, she knew. Patrick had been young, caught up in his dreams of striking it rich. He had loved her in his way, and she had no doubt he would have loved William had he lived to know him better. But Miles' steady presence, his quiet strength and unwavering support, were showing her what a partnership could truly be. The thought was unsettling. She was a widow of less than a year, dependent on Miles' charity. Any feelings beyond gratitude and friendship were inappropriate and potentially disastrous. Yet she couldn't deny the warmth that filled her when he smiled at her, or the sense of rightness she felt moving about his cabin as if it were her own. As they continued their journey home, William now content and babbling happily, Margaret resolved to guard her heart more carefully. Miles had offered them sanctuary, not courtship. She would do well to remember the difference. Founder's Day in Whitefish Creek was everything Miles had promised, a joyful celebration bringing together families from throughout the surrounding countryside. The town square was decorated with bunting and lanterns. Tables laden with food lined one side, and a platform had been erected for the musicians who were already playing lively tunes when Miles, Margaret, and William arrived. Margaret felt a flutter of nervousness as they approached the gathering. She hadn't been in such a social situation since before Patrick's death, and never in a community where she was a stranger. But Miles' steady presence beside her was reassuring, as was William's weight in her arms, grounding her in the present. "Miles Sutton," called a booming voice. A tall man with an impressive mustache strode toward them, hand extended. "Thought you might not make it this year." "Wouldn't miss it, Sheriff," Miles replied, shaking the man's hand. "Margaret, this is Sheriff Tom Dawson. Tom, Mrs. Margaret Flynn and her son William." The sheriff tipped his hat to Margaret. "Madam, pleasure to meet you. Fine-looking boy you have there." "Thank you, Sheriff," Margaret replied, relaxing slightly at his friendly manner. "Miles bringing you around means you must be special," the sheriff continued with a wink. "Man hardly socializes unless forced at gunpoint." Miles looked embarrassed. "Don't listen to him, Margaret. Tom exaggerates." "Do I now?" the sheriff laughed. "When was the last time you attended a social, Miles? Christmas '76. "I've been busy," Miles defended himself, though without heat. "Too busy for living, if you ask me," Sheriff Dawson replied good-naturedly. "But seems you're making up for lost time now." He tipped his hat again. "Mrs. Flynn, hope you enjoy our little celebration. Excuse me, duty calls." As the sheriff moved off to break up a minor dispute at the refreshment table, Miles guided Margaret toward the gathering. "Sorry about that," he murmured. "Tom's a good man but lacks what my mother would call discretion." Margaret smiled. "I like him. He seems to care about you." "Most folks around here look out for each other," Miles explained. "Nature of things in country this wild." They made their way through the crowd, Miles introducing Margaret to what seemed like half the county. Each greeting was friendly, though Margaret noticed curious glances and a few raised eyebrows at her presence with the normally solitary rancher. Mrs. Caldwell appeared, claiming William for a cuddle while insisting that Margaret and Miles join the dancing. Margaret hesitated, but Miles surprised her by offering his hand. "Might as well give them something real to talk about," he said with a rare grin. "If you're willing." Margaret placed her hand in his, feeling a frisson of awareness at the contact. "I'd be delighted, though I warn you, I'm out of practice." "Makes two of us," Miles admitted as he led her to where couples were forming lines for a Virginia reel. Despite their protestations of rustiness, they moved well together. Miles was surprisingly graceful for such a tall man, and Margaret found herself laughing as they twirled and stepped in time to the fiddle music. When the dance ended, they were both slightly breathless, and Margaret was aware of the warmth of Miles' hand at her waist. "Not bad for a couple of recluses," she teased. Something shifted in Miles' eyes, a warmth, an openness she hadn't seen before. "Not bad at all." The moment was interrupted by the arrival of a young woman who addressed Miles with obvious familiarity. "Miles Sutton, dancing." The world must be ending. Miles turned, his expression closing slightly. "Hello, Rebecca. Didn't know you were back in town." The young woman was perhaps 25, pretty in a delicate way, with blonde hair and blue eyes. She looked at Margaret with undisguised curiosity. "Got back last month," she replied. "Pa's health isn't good." She extended a hand to Margaret. "Rebecca Wilson. My father owns the sawmill." "Margaret Flynn," Margaret replied, taking the offered hand. "Pleased to meet you." Rebecca's gaze moved between them, assessing. "How do you know our Miles?" There was a slight emphasis on "our" that made Margaret's spine stiffen. Before she could respond, Miles answered smoothly. "Margaret's husband was a war buddy of mine. She and William, her son, are staying at the ranch for a while." "How kind of you," Rebecca said, though her tone suggested she found it more puzzling than kind. "Always the gentleman, aren't you, Miles?" There was history there. Margaret realized, perhaps a romantic history, given the way Rebecca was looking at Miles. The thought created an unexpected knot in her stomach. "Just doing what anyone would," Miles replied, his discomfort evident. "Hardly anyone," Rebecca corrected, then turned back to Margaret. "Has he shown you the falls yet? Most beautiful spot in the county." "Miles used to take me there for picnics." The knot in Margaret's stomach tightened. Definitely a romantic history then. "We've been rather busy at the ranch," Margaret said, keeping her tone neutral. "Well, you must insist he take you. It's not to be missed." Rebecca touched Miles' arm familiarly. "Save me a dance later." Miles nodded, though without enthusiasm. "If you like." As Rebecca moved away, Miles let out a slow breath. "Sorry about that, old friend?" Margaret asked, aiming for casual and not entirely succeeding. Miles ran a hand through his hair. "Something like that. It was. A while ago." Margaret wanted to ask more, but sensed his reluctance. Instead, she suggested they check on William, who was now surrounded by a group of admiring women, with Mrs. Caldwell proudly showing him off. The rest of the day passed pleasantly, though Margaret was more aware than ever of the curious glances and whispered conversations that followed them. Miles danced with Rebecca as promised, but spent most of his time with Margaret, introducing her to more neighbors and ensuring she and William were comfortable. As evening fell, lanterns were lit around the square, casting a warm glow over the continuing festivities. A bonfire was built at the center, and people gathered around to roast corn and apples. William had fallen asleep against Margaret's shoulder, worn out by the excitement and attention. "Ready to head home?" Miles asked, noticing her stroking William's back soothingly. "Home." The word sent a pang through Margaret. The ranch had begun to feel like home in a way Redemption Creek never had, but it wasn't truly hers. She was a guest, a charity case, however kindly Miles treated her. "If you don't mind," she replied. "It's been wonderful," but Williams had quite enough excitement. Miles nodded, placing a gentle hand on her back as he guided her toward their wagon. Several people called out goodbyes, including Mrs. Caldwell, who extracted a promise from Margaret to visit again soon. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. William sleeping soundly in Margaret's arms and both adults lost in their own thoughts. The moon was rising, casting silver light over the landscape and turning the trail into a ghostly path before them. "Did you enjoy yourself?" Miles asked finally, breaking the comfortable silence. "Very much," Margaret assured him. "Everyone was so welcoming." Miles glanced at her. "Even Rebecca," Margaret hesitated. "She seemed interested in you." A soft laugh escaped him. "Not in the way you think. Rebecca and I courted briefly 2 years ago. It didn't work out. May I ask why?" The question slipped out before Margaret could stop it. "I'm sorry, that's far too personal." "It's all right," Miles said. "Nothing dramatic. She wanted a husband who'd move to town, take over her father's business." "I'm not a town man, never will be." Margaret absorbed this information. "She's very pretty." "Yes," Miles agreed simply. Then, after a pause, "but not for me." The words hung between them, laden with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Margaret found herself wondering what kind of woman would be for Miles Sutton, and whether she could ever be that woman. As the wagon crested the final hill before the ranch, the cabin came into view, a single lantern burning in the window where Miles had left it lit for their return. It looked welcoming, peaceful, everything a home should be. "Thank you for today," Margaret said softly. "For the dress, the dancing, all of it." Miles' profile was strong in the moonlight as he guided the horses down the slope. "No need for thanks. I enjoyed it too. More than I expected to, truth be told." When they reached the cabin, Miles helped Margaret down, his hands strong and sure at her waist. For a moment they stood close, William sleeping between them, the night quiet except for the soft nickering of the horses and the distant call of an owl. "Margaret," Miles began, his voice low and uncertain, but whatever he might have said was interrupted by William stirring and letting out a small cry. The moment broke, and Margaret stepped back, adjusting her hold on her son. "I should get him to bed," she said, her voice not quite steady. "Good night, Miles." "Good night," he replied, watching as she made her way into the cabin. As Margaret settled William in his cradle, she was acutely aware of the sound of Miles caring for the horses outside. Her feelings for him were growing stronger each day, developing into something far more complex than gratitude. But she was still a widow, still dependent on his charity, still uncertain of her future. She couldn't afford to mistake kindness for courtship, or to risk the sanctuary they had found by reaching for something more. Yet as she readied herself for bed, Margaret couldn't help remembering the way Miles had looked at her as they danced, or the warmth of his hand at her waist in the moonlight. For the first time since Patrick's death, she allowed herself to imagine a future that included not just security for herself and William, but also happiness, perhaps even love. September brought cooler temperatures and subtle changes to the rhythm of life at the Sutton Ranch. Miles spent long days preparing for winter, repairing fences, stocking firewood, and ensuring the barn was weathertight. Margaret took charge of preserving the garden's final harvest, filling the root cellar with jars of vegetables and fruits. William continued to thrive, now pulling himself up on furniture and babbling constantly. His first tooth had appeared, much to Margaret's relief after several fussy nights. Miles had carved him wooden toys, a horse, a bear, and a simple wagon which William dragged across the cabin floor with delighted concentration. The dynamic between Miles and Margaret had shifted subtly since the Founder's Day celebration. There was a new awareness between them, evident in the way Miles' hand would linger when passing her a dish at dinner, or how Margaret would catch herself watching him as he worked in the yard. Neither spoke of it directly, but it hung in the air between them, a possibility neither was quite ready to name. One crisp morning, Miles announced he needed to ride to the north pasture to check on a section of fence before the first snow. "Should be back by sundown," he told Margaret as he finished his breakfast. "Nothing to worry about," Margaret nodded, already planning the day's tasks. "Be careful, the weather's changing." Miles smiled at her concern. "Always am." He hesitated, then added, "Thought maybe tomorrow we could ride up to the falls. Weather should hold, and it's pretty this time of year with the leaves turning." Margaret remembered Rebecca's words at the celebration. "The falls you used to visit with Rebecca." Miles looked slightly uncomfortable. "It's not. It doesn't belong to anyone, it's just a beautiful spot." Understanding his discomfort, Margaret smiled. "I'd love to see it. William would enjoy the adventure." Relief crossed Miles' face. "Good, we'll make a day of it." He rose, donning his hat and coat. "See you this evening." As the day progressed, Margaret found herself looking forward to the promised outing with unexpected excitement. She prepared a stew for dinner, letting it simmer slowly so it would be ready whenever Miles returned, and baked bread to accompany it. But as afternoon stretched into evening and the light began to fade without any sign of Miles, Margaret grew concerned. She fed William and put him down for the night, then took to pacing by the window, watching the trail for any sign of movement. When full darkness fell and Miles still hadn't returned, Margaret's concern deepened to worry. It wasn't like him to be late without sending word. What if he'd been injured? What if his horse had thrown him? The north pasture was remote. If he was hurt, he could be lying out there alone in the increasingly cold night. By 9 o'clock, Margaret had made a decision. She couldn't leave William alone to search, but she couldn't simply wait and hope either. Bundling the sleeping baby securely, she carried him to the barn where she saddled Willow, the mare Miles had been teaching her to ride. It was a struggle. She'd never saddled a horse alone before, but determination drove her. With William secured against her chest in a sling and a lantern in one hand, Margaret set out toward the north pasture, following the trail Miles had described that morning. The night was clear but cold, stars glittering overhead and a half-moon providing just enough light to supplement her lantern. She rode cautiously, mindful of both William's safety and her own limited riding skills. "Please be all right," she whispered, uncertain whether she was addressing her prayer to God or directly to Miles. She had ridden perhaps 2 miles when Willow suddenly nickered, ears pricking forward. A moment later, Margaret heard an answering nicker and saw the glow of another lantern approaching through the trees. "Margaret," Miles' voice called, a mixture of surprise and alarm. "What in heaven's name are you doing out here?" Relief flooded through her as he came into view, mounted on his stallion and apparently unharmed. "You didn't come home," she explained, suddenly feeling foolish. "I was worried something had happened." Miles urged his horse forward until they were side by side. In the lantern light, she could see a mixture of emotions on his face: concern, bewilderment, and something warmer she couldn't quite name. "You rode out alone at night with William because you were worried about me?" His voice held a note of wonder. Margaret lifted her chin slightly. "Yes." "Was that wrong?" Miles shook his head slowly. "No, not wrong, just unexpected." He reached across to touch William's sleeping form gently. "Is he all right?" "He's fine. Sleeping through his first rescue mission." A smile touched Miles' lips. "I'm sorry I worried you." "Fence was worse than I thought, took longer to repair. Then one of the horses got loose, had to round him up. Should have sent word." "Are you all right?" Margaret asked, scanning him for injuries. "Right as rain, just tired and hungry." His expression softened. "No one's worried about me in a long time, Margaret. It's nice." The simple admission touched her deeply. "Well, get used to it," she said lightly. "As long as William and I are at the ranch, you'll have someone waiting for you to come home." Something shifted in Miles' gaze at her words. He reached across the space between their horses and took her gloved hand in his. "Margaret." But whatever he might have said was interrupted by William stirring in his sling, disturbed by their voices. Miles squeezed her hand once, then released it. "Let's get you both home," he said. "It's too cold for the little one to be out." They rode side by side in companionable silence, the moment suspended between them. Margaret was acutely aware of Miles beside her, solid and reassuring in the darkness. Whatever had been about to transpire between them would have to wait, but she sensed a turning point had been reached. Back at the ranch, Miles insisted on taking William while Margaret dismounted, then carried the still sleeping baby into the cabin while she unsaddled Willow. When she joined them inside, she found Miles had stoked the fire and was warming his hands by the flames, his expression thoughtful. "Stew's still warm," Margaret offered, moving to the stove. "You must be hungry." Miles turned to face her. "Margaret, what you did tonight was brave." "Foolish, maybe, but brave. Riding out alone at night. I couldn't just wait here, not knowing if you were hurt," she explained simply. Miles crossed the room to stand before her. "No one's ever done anything like that for me before." The vulnerability in his admission moved her. Then they didn't care enough. Miles' hand came up to touch her cheek, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I don't think I knew what it meant to have someone care until you and William came into my life." Margaret's heart quickened at his touch, at the warmth in his blue eyes. "Miles." He hesitated, then slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss so tender it brought tears to her eyes. It was brief, almost questioning, and when he drew back, his expression was uncertain. "I've wanted to do that since Founder's Day," he admitted softly. "Maybe before." Margaret reached up to touch his face, feeling the slight roughness of his evening beard beneath her fingers. "I've wanted you to." Relief and happiness transformed his features. He drew her into his arms, holding her close, his cheek resting against her hair. They stood that way for a long moment, content just to be in each other's embrace. "I'm not good with words, Margaret," Miles said finally. "Never have been, but I want you to know that what I feel for you, it's real. Not gratitude, not obligation, something more." Margaret drew back just enough to look up at him. "I feel it too, but Miles, I'm still a widow. William and I are still dependent on your charity. It complicates things." "To hell with complications," Miles said with unexpected vehemence. "I've spent 10 years alone, keeping my distance from everyone. Then you and William show up, and suddenly this place feels like a home, not just somewhere I hang my hat." He took her hands in his. "I'm not asking for promises, Margaret, just a chance for us to see where this might lead." The sincerity in his eyes, the earnestness in his voice, melted the last of Margaret's reservations. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'd like that very much." Miles' smile was radiant as he bent to kiss her again, this time with more confidence. Margaret responded in kind, allowing herself to enjoy the warmth and strength of him, the gentle pressure of his lips against hers, the sense of rightness that enveloped them both. When they finally parted, Miles rested his forehead against hers. "I should eat that stew before it goes cold," he murmured. "And you should get some rest. It's been a long night." Margaret nodded, though she was reluctant to break the moment. "Tomorrow's adventure to the falls is still on." "Absolutely," Miles confirmed. "Though perhaps with less drama than tonight's excursion." Margaret laughed softly. "One can hope." As she readied herself for bed, checking on William, who continued to sleep peacefully, Margaret felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. The future still held uncertainties, but for the first time since Patrick's death, she was looking forward to it with anticipation rather than dread. And if the way Miles had looked at her, had held her, was any indication, that future might be brighter than she had ever dared to hope. The falls were even more beautiful than Margaret had imagined, a cascade of crystal-clear water, tumbling down a series of rocky ledges into a pool surrounded by aspens, now turned golden with autumn. The sound of rushing water filled the air, creating a peaceful backdrop to their picnic on the grassy bank. William was enthralled by his surroundings, crawling energetically across the blanket Miles had spread and trying to grab at anything within reach. Miles had fashioned a small fishing line and was showing the baby how to hold it, though William was more interested in trying to eat the stick than learning to fish. "He'll get the hang of it in a few years," Miles laughed, gently removing the stick from William's mouth for the third time. Margaret watched them together, her heart full. The change in Miles since their kiss the previous night was subtle but unmistakable, a new openness, a lightness to his manner that made him seem younger. He had been attentive all day, helping her with William, ensuring she was comfortable on the ride up, small gestures that spoke volumes. "Penny for your thoughts," Miles said, noticing her watching them. Margaret smiled. "I was just thinking how natural you are with him. You'd make a wonderful father." The words slipped out before she could consider their implications, and she felt heat rise to her cheeks, but Miles didn't seem taken aback. "I hope to have that chance someday," he said simply, his gaze steady on hers. The moment was charged with meaning. Margaret looked away first, overwhelmed by the direction her thoughts were taking. It was too soon, too complicated. Yet she couldn't deny the rightness she felt sitting here with Miles and William, as if they were already a family. "Tell me about the ranch in winter," she said, changing the subject to safer ground. "Is it very harsh?" Miles accepted the shift in conversation gracefully. "It can be. Snow gets deep, temperatures drop below zero sometimes, but the cabin's solid and we've got plenty of firewood stacked. Cattle know how to find shelter in the worst of it. And do you go into town much in winter? Less than in summer. Roads can get impassable. Christmas at the Caldwells is about the only social obligation I keep." He looked at her. "But this winter will be different with you and William there." Margaret nodded, considering the months ahead. "I've never experienced a Montana winter. Is it very isolating?" "Can be," Miles admitted. "But there's a beauty to it too, the quiet, the clean white landscape, stars so bright on clear nights it feels like you could reach up and grab them." He hesitated. "Are you worried about being snowed in with just me for company?" The question held a vulnerability that touched her. "No," she assured him. "Not at all, I'm just trying to prepare myself. Back in Boston, winter meant crowded streets and coal smoke. In Redemption Creek, it meant mud and more whiskey brawls than usual." Miles chuckled at her description. "Well, I can promise you clean air and peace here. Though I can't guarantee William won't get cabin fever." "We'll manage," Margaret said confidently. "He's an adaptable little soul." As if to prove her point, William chose that moment to abandon the fishing stick and crawl determinedly toward the edge of the blanket, drawn by a butterfly fluttering nearby. Miles scooped him up before he could reach the damp grass. "Whoa there, partner," he said, settling the baby on his lap. "Let's not go swimming just yet." William protested briefly, then became distracted by Miles' watch chain, which he proceeded to examine with intense concentration. Miles smiled down at him, then glanced up to find Margaret watching them with an expression that made his heart skip. "What?" he asked softly. "Just you," she replied. "The way you are with him, the way you look right now." Miles' expression softened. "Happy, because I am, Margaret, happier than I've been in longer than I can remember." The simple honesty of his words moved her deeply. Setting aside her caution, Margaret moved closer until she was beside him on the blanket, their shoulders touching. Miles shifted William so he sat between them, then tentatively put his arm around Margaret's waist. They sat that way for a long while, watching the play of light on the falling water, listening to William's contented babbling. simply being together without the need for words. It was a perfect moment, one Margaret knew she would treasure regardless of what the future held. Eventually, William's eyelids began to droop, the excitement of the day catching up with him. Margaret cradled him as he drifted to sleep, his small body warm against hers. "We should head back," Miles suggested, though he seemed reluctant to break the spell of the afternoon. "Don't want to be on the trail after dark." They packed up their picnic, Miles taking special care to ensure the blanket was wrapped securely around William before helping Margaret onto her horse. The ride back to the ranch was peaceful, the forest around them vibrant with autumn colors, and the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the trail. As they crested the final rise before the ranch came into view, Miles drew his horse to a halt beside Margaret's. "Thank you for coming with me today," he said. "This place has always been special to me, but sharing it with you and William, it means more than I can say." Margaret smiled, understanding what he couldn't quite put into words. "It's a magical spot. Thank you for showing it to us." Miles hesitated, then asked the question that had been on his mind all day. "Would you stay, Margaret, not just through the winter, but longer?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. "Miles, I know it's soon," he hurried on. "I know you're still grieving Patrick, still finding your feet. But I need you to know that there's a place for you here, for both of you, for as long as you want it." Margaret looked at him, this good, honorable man who had quite literally saved her and William from a terrible fate, who had opened his home and, gradually, his heart to them, who looked at her son with such tenderness it made her ache. "I don't know what the future holds," she said carefully, "but I do know that being here with you feels right in a way nothing has in a very long time." Miles nodded, accepting that this was all she could offer for now. "That's enough for me." As they rode down to the cabin, Margaret found herself imagining more days like this one, picnics by the falls, evenings by the fire, watching William grow strong and happy in this beautiful place. And Miles beside her through it all, his quiet strength a foundation she could build upon. It was too soon for certainties, too soon for promises. But for the first time since the auctioneer's gavel had fallen, condemning her and William to what she'd thought would be a life of servitude or worse, Margaret Flynn allowed herself to hope for happiness, real, lasting happiness, with Miles Sutton. Winter descended on the Montana highlands with surprising swiftness. One day the hills were ablaze with autumn colors. The next, a fierce storm blew in from the north, leaving 6 inches of snow in its wake and transforming the landscape into a white wonderland. More snow followed, and by early December, the ranch was effectively cut off from town except by horseback through the most direct routes. Miles had prepared well, ensuring they had ample supplies, firewood, and feed for the livestock. The cattle had been moved to the southern pastures, where natural shelters and windbreaks offered protection from the worst of the weather. The barn was snug, the cabin warmer than Margaret had expected thanks to Miles' careful maintenance of the stone fireplace and the smaller stove in the bedroom where she and William slept. Life settled into a new rhythm, dictated by the shortened daylight hours and the demands of keeping the ranch functioning in harsh conditions. Miles rose before dawn each day to check on the animals and break ice on the water troughs, returning for breakfast with snow clinging to his coat and hat. Margaret kept the home fires burning, quite literally, while caring for William and preparing hearty meals to combat the cold. William, now 9 months old, was pulling himself up on furniture and cruising along the edges, eager to explore his world despite the limitations of being mostly confined indoors. Miles had set up a small pen for him near the fireplace where he could play safely while Margaret worked, though both adults found themselves constantly retrieving toys, thrown enthusiastically beyond its boundaries. One evening in mid-December, a particularly fierce blizzard howled around the cabin, the wind finding every crack and crevice despite Miles' best efforts at weatherproofing. Margaret had just put William to bed after an exhausting day of keeping him entertained indoors, and she joined Miles by the fire where he was mending a piece of tack. "Storm's a bad one," he commented, looking up as she entered. "Might last through tomorrow." Margaret nodded, settling into the rocking chair opposite him. "William was restless all day. I think he senses the weather, or perhaps he's just tired of being cooped up." "Can't blame him," Miles said with a small smile. "Cabin fever sets in early when you're that age and full of energy." "Did you manage to check all the cattle today?" Margaret asked, noticing the lines of fatigue around his eyes. Miles nodded. "They're hunkered down in the south draw. Should be fine." He set aside his work and stretched, his shoulders cracking audibly. "Spring will be here before we know it." Margaret smiled at his attempt to sound optimistic. "Only 3 more months of winter, you mean?" he chuckled. "Something like that." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the wind and the crackle of the fire. Over the past weeks, they had grown more at ease with each other, their relationship deepening in small, meaningful ways. Miles would reach for her hand as they sat by the fire in the evenings. Margaret would touch his shoulder as she passed his chair, or brush snow from his hair when he came in from outside. They had shared more kisses, some brief and sweet, others deeper and full of promise, but Miles had been careful not to press for more, respecting her still recent widowhood and the complexity of their situation. "Christmas is only a week away," Margaret remarked, breaking the silence. "Will we be able to get to town for the Caldwell's celebration if this weather continues?" Miles considered. "If it clears in the next day or two, the trail should be passable by Christmas Eve. If not," he shrugged, "we might have to have our own celebration here." Margaret nodded, trying not to show her disappointment. She had been looking forward to the gathering, both for William's sake and for the chance to see the friends she had made in Whitefish Creek. "William won't know the difference, I suppose, and there's plenty to be grateful for right here." Miles studied her face in the firelight. "You miss people, don't you, being around others?" "Sometimes," she admitted. "Not like in Redemption Creek. I don't miss the gossip or the judgments, but friendly faces, conversation. Yes, I miss that occasionally." Miles was quiet for a moment. "Is it very hard for you, being out here with just me and William for company?" The question revealed a vulnerability Margaret had come to recognize in him, a concern that his solitary lifestyle might not be enough for her. She rose from her chair and moved to kneel beside his, taking his weathered hands in hers. "No, Miles, it's not hard at all. In fact, these past months have been the most peaceful, the most content I've felt in years." She looked up at him, wanting him to see the truth in her eyes. "Being here with you has been a blessing I never expected." Relief softened his features. He raised one hand to touch her cheek gently. "I feel the same way, Margaret, having you and William here. It's changed everything." The tenderness in his touch, the warmth in his gaze emboldened Margaret. Rising slightly, she leaned forward and kissed him, putting into the gesture all the feelings she had been carefully containing for weeks. Miles responded immediately, his arms coming around her, drawing her up until she was sitting across his lap, their kiss deepening into something more urgent than any they had shared before. Margaret's hands moved to his shoulders, feeling the solid strength of him beneath his woolen shirt. His fingers tangled in her hair, which she had left loose after her evening bath. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily. Miles rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if savoring the moment. "Margaret," he whispered, her name a caress on his lips. "I know," she replied softly. "I feel it too." He opened his eyes, their blue depths dark with emotion. "I love you, have for a while now. Probably since that night you rode out looking for me, maybe before." The simple declaration, spoken without flourish but with profound sincerity, filled Margaret with joy. "I love you too, Miles, so much it frightens me sometimes." A smile of pure happiness transformed his face. "Does it? Why?" She struggled to articulate her fears. "Because I never expected to feel this way again. After Patrick, after everything. I thought that part of my life was over. And then there's William and our situation," and Miles silenced her with a gentle finger against her lips. "Margaret Flynn, I love you. I love William as if he were my own son. Nothing else matters to me except that you both are safe and happy." He took a deep breath. "I want to build a life with you, a real life, not this temporary arrangement we've been pretending is enough." Margaret's heart raced at his words. "What are you saying, Miles?" He shifted slightly, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a small object. "I've been carrying this around for weeks, waiting for the right moment." He opened his palm to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond. "It was my mother's. I'd be honored if you'd wear it." Margaret stared at the ring, then at Miles' face, hardly daring to believe what was happening. "Miles, are you asking? Margaret Flynn, will you marry me? Be my wife, let me be a father to William, make this ranch a true home for all of us." Tears filled Margaret's eyes as happiness welled up within her. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Miles Sutton, I will marry you." With hands that trembled slightly, Miles slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit as if it had been made for her. He kissed her again, a kiss filled with promise and passion and a future suddenly crystal clear before them. When they separated, Margaret remained in his embrace, her head resting against his shoulder. "When?" she asked simply. Miles considered. "Spring would be practical easier for folks to travel to the wedding. But I'd marry you tomorrow if we could get to town." Margaret smiled against his shirt. "Spring sounds perfect. The snow will be gone, flowers blooming. A new beginning." "A new beginning," Miles echoed, his voice rich with contentment. "For all of us." They sat together by the fire as the blizzard raged outside, talking of plans and dreams, of a future that neither had imagined possible just months before. Miles spoke of expanding the ranch, building a larger bedroom for William as he grew, perhaps adding more rooms if their family expanded. "Would you want that?" he asked tentatively. "More children." Margaret's heart swelled at the hope in his voice. "I would, very much." "William should have brothers and sisters to grow up with." Miles' arms tightened around her. "I never thought I'd have a family of my own. After the war, after everything I saw and did, I didn't think I deserved one." Margaret raised her head to look at him. "Oh, Miles. If anyone deserves happiness, it's you. You're the most honorable, the kindest man I've ever known." He kissed her again, gently this time. "Thank you for seeing something in me worth loving." "Thank you for saving us that day in Redemption Creek," she replied. "For giving us a home when we had none." "Best thing I ever did," Miles said with absolute conviction. "Riding into that auction might have looked like charity to others, but it was the most selfish thing I've ever done. I saved myself that day, Margaret. You and William saved me from a life of loneliness I hadn't even fully acknowledged until you showed me what I was missing." The profound gratitude in his voice moved Margaret deeply. She had never considered that she and William might have given Miles as much as he had given them. The realization balanced their relationship in a way that felt right and true. As the evening grew late, they reluctantly parted, Miles to his loft and Margaret to the bedroom she shared with William. But there was a new understanding between them, a commitment that went beyond the ring now gleaming on Margaret's finger. Come spring, they would be a true family in name as well as in heart. and that knowledge made the howling winter storm outside seem like nothing more than a passing inconvenience on the road to their shared future. The Christmas season at the Sutton Ranch was unlike any Margaret had experienced before. Unable to reach town due to continuing bad weather, they created their own celebration, intimate and heartfelt. Miles cut a small pine from the edge of the forest and set it up in the cabin, which Margaret decorated with paper ornaments she fashioned during William's naps. Popcorn strung on thread and pine cones dipped in flour, paste to resemble snow, completed the simple but charming display. William was enchanted by the tree, attempting to crawl toward it at every opportunity, until Miles constructed a small barrier to keep him at a safe distance. Miles had carved a set of wooden animals for William's Christmas gift: a horse, cow, sheep, and bear, each smooth and perfectly sized for small hands. Margaret had knitted Miles a scarf from yarn she'd found in a trunk, working on it secretly in the evenings after he'd gone up to his loft. For Margaret, Miles had ridden out alone one clear morning, returning with a package wrapped carefully in oilcloth. On Christmas morning, after William had been thoroughly distracted by his new toys, Miles presented it to her with uncharacteristic shyness. "It's not much," he apologized as she unwrapped it, "and if you don't like it, I won't be offended." Inside was a small painting in a hand-carved frame, a rendering of the falls where they had picnicked, the autumn colors captured with surprising skill. Margaret gasped in delight. "Miles, it's beautiful. Did you paint this?" He nodded, a hint of color touching his cheeks. "Used to draw a bit before the war. Started again this fall. Thought you might like a reminder of that day." "I love it," Margaret assured him, deeply touched by the personal nature of the gift. "I didn't know you were an artist." Miles shrugged, embarrassed by her praise. "Wouldn't go that far, just something I enjoy now and then." Margaret hung the painting on the wall beside the fireplace where she could see it from her rocking chair. It added a touch of color and warmth to the cabin, but more importantly, it represented a side of Miles she was just beginning to discover, a sensitivity that balanced his rugged exterior. The days between Christmas and New Year passed in a peaceful blur. Margaret wrote letters to the few friends she'd made in Whitefish Creek, announcing their engagement, while Miles worked on plans to expand the garden and possibly the cabin itself in the spring. William continued his determined efforts to walk, managing to stand unassisted for brief moments before plopping back onto the wooden floor with a look of frustrated determination that made both adults laugh. On New Year's Eve, after William was asleep, Miles opened a bottle of wine he'd been saving for a special occasion. They sat before the fire, glasses in hand, reflecting on the extraordinary year that was ending. "If someone had told me last New Year's what this year would bring, I'd never have believed them," Margaret mused, the firelight catching the diamond on her finger as she gesticulated. "So much has changed." Miles nodded, his expression thoughtful. "For the better, I hope." "Without question," she assured him, reaching for his hand. "Despite everything, Patrick's death, the auction, all of it, I can't help but feel blessed. William is healthy and happy. We have a home, a future." She squeezed his fingers. "And I found you." Miles raised her hand to his lips. "I've been thinking about our wedding," he said. "Weather permitting, we could aim for April. The worst of the mud season should be over, but before the really busy time with the cattle begins." Margaret nodded. "April sounds perfect. Nothing fancy, just family and close friends." "Reverend Thomas can perform the ceremony," Miles continued. "And Mrs. Caldwell has already volunteered her garden for the reception whenever we set the date." "You've discussed it with her?" Margaret asked, surprised. Miles looked slightly sheepish. "I might have mentioned my intentions when I purchased your ring in town back in October." Margaret laughed, delighted by this revelation. "So you've been planning this for months?" "Since about a week after you arrived," Miles admitted with a grin, "though I tried to be patient." The thought of Miles carrying the ring for months, waiting for the right moment to propose, warmed Margaret's heart. She leaned forward to kiss him softly, feeling a sense of deep connection and love. "Thank you for being so patient, for making all of this a reality. I can't imagine a better partner for this next chapter of our lives." They continued to talk, sharing dreams and hopes for their future, the fire crackling in the background, and for the first time in years, Margaret truly believed that happiness was within her reach. As the clock struck midnight, they toasted to the new year and to the bright future ahead, united as a family with a shared purpose and unwavering love.